When I say that the Empire of Trebizond was more Byzantine than the Byzantium which the Palaiologoi restored in 1261, I think I may have a point. Let us recall the history of the Constantinopolitan Empire. It was the direct continuation of the Imperium founded by Augustus himself, and adamantly claimed to be New Rome even after countless hardships reduced its territories into something a Roman from Augustan times would never recognize. Gone were the core Latin provinces of the empire, and the seat of Roman imperial legitimacy, the eternal city of old Rome. But New Rome preserved through the Dark Ages and emerged as a reborn phoenix in the High Middle Ages. This medieval phase of Roman civilization was of course different from the classical one we were used to, but it was brilliantly adapted to circumstances, ushering in a golden age. The exact same happened for Trebizond in the late 13th century, after initial failures in their attempt to restore Constantinople as direct successors of the Komnenian dynasty. The Trapezuntine Empire of the Megali Komneni took another direction, developed new strategies, and a new unique identity. You'll see what I mean once I present to you the Golden Age of Trebizond. Our current monarch in Trebizond was Ioannis II Megas Komnenos, Emperor of the Rome. Oh, hold up. I'm legally not allowed to use that title for the Trapezuntine Emperor anymore, according to Michael VIII Palaiologos. Okay, sorry, Mike. What I meant was Ioannis, Βασιλεύς και Autocrat πάσης Ανατολής, Iberians και Υπερατίας. There. Happy? Jeez. Yes, so this was the new imperial title Palaiologos gave to his son-in-law, Ioannis. It means Emperor and Autocrat of all the East, the Iberians, and the Transmarine Provinces. It's a mouthful, listing down the domains of the Trapezuntines, but it's indicative of the new path Trebizond is taking. Instead of looking towards the west, towards Constantinople, Megali Komneni now turned east, towards Georgia, who helped build their state in the first place, and the wider Islamic and Mongol worlds in Asia. Another possible Palaiologian position which shows us this is how the Megali Komneni no longer could use the double-headed eagle as their insignia, but only the single-headed eagle, which looks towards the right. For most, right is the direction of the east. But I say possible because I couldn't find the source which claims it. An old tome by the last Metropolitan of Trebizond, Chrysanthos Philippidis. I usually don't talk about such uncertain things, but Chrysanthos was renowned for his knowledge of Trebizond, among other things, so I'm just throwing this out there in case anyone knows more about the eagles. In short, Trebizond was becoming a more Eastern Rome. When Ioannis was with Palaiologos, the West Georgian king, David Narin, besieged Trebizond as retaliation in 1282 for the Trapezuntine emperor's rapprochement policy with Constantinople. This was the beginning of a series of Georgian troubles for the Trebizond. The empire was indeed built with Georgian help. Georgian influences always remained in some degree in the Pontic state, but now Georgia was more controlled by the Mongols than Trebizond, and divided after David Narin broke away from East Georgia. Narin's state, no longer possessing the grandeur of Tamar the Great's empire, would of course feel threatened by their waning grasp on Trebizond. But Narin failed his siege and left. He annexed Khaneti, the easternmost part of the empire, before going home to plot even more. This was what Ioannis found when he returned to Trebizond in 1283, and his only solace was the birth of his son, Alexios, with this new Palaiologian empress, before he had to deal with more drama in 1284. Georgios, Ioannis' betrayed brother, after being freed from the Ilkhanids and conspiring with the king of East Georgia, tried to take the throne again, but failed. He was never heard of again. Then at the same time, Narin backed Ioannis' half-sister, Theodora, whose mother was the late Manuel I's Georgian consort, to the Trapezuntine throne. This time, the coup against Ioannis succeeded, and Theodora Megas Komnenos became the first empress of Trebizond for a year. She was the only Trapezuntine empress to have minted her own coins, but that's literally the only thing we know about her reign. Ioannis and Evdokia Palaiologoi took refuge in Pontic Tripolis, where Evdokia founded a monastery called Blacherna, like the one in her native Constantinople. Then, they restored themselves to the throne in 1285 and Theodora fled, maybe to Georgia. She was never heard of again. And just when I was happy to finally piece together a narrative, no matter how brief, we have nothing to go on again. Yay! We know scattered information about the rest of Ioannis' reign, and I'll do my best to piece them for you. One very significant thing, which should have happened around the late 1280s and early 1290s, was the establishment of the Genoese trader colony in Trebizond. Why does that matter? Well, if you remember back from when I talked about Palaiologian history, you remember how much the Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa, interfered many times for the worse in Roman politics. Trebizond, on the Black Sea, had been spared their buffoonery for some time, but now the Genoese merchants made it from the Mediterranean to Pontus. And the Genoese mercantile exploitation of the Black Sea will have consequences for Trebizond, although for now it brought only advantages, as those wily traders increased Trapezuntine revenue. It was under Ioannis that the impacts of the sack of Baghdad were exploited to the max by Trebizond. The route to Tabriz, on which it lay, exploded in traffic only once the Genoese began discovering Trebizond. Whatever wealth Manuel had amassed for the empire, Ioannis multiplied it. This made Ioannis filthy rich. So rich that he and his empress Evdokia were able to sponsor several major building projects through their reign, refurnishing local Pontic churches like the Panagiotis Chrysoscephalos and the Church of St. Eugenius with more prestigious Constantinopolitan architectural elements. This was part of their policy to develop closer ties with Palaiologian Constantinople, and they pursued it so much that there's even a theory that the Hagia Sophia of Trebizond, which most attribute to Manuel I, was actually their project. Evdokia certainly had the reputation of being a great builder, as a Pontian myth credits her with founding the St. Gregory of Nyssa church in Trebizond too. But I digress before I ramble about Trapezuntine monuments. So point is, notice the trend here. Ioannis was opening up to the west, to immediate neighbors like Constantinople and Genoese colonies. Yes, but also to those further away. His renown was so great that the Pope wrote to him in 1291 asking him to be Christendom's ambassador to the Mongols. The next year, Englishmen were recorded to have been hosted by the emperor on their way to meet the Mongols in Tabriz. Trebizond became the first gateway to the Silk Road world for many Latins, and they developed this imagination of Trebizond as a rich and exotic land of every pleasure. However, Ioannis' diplomatic policies with Western allies did not mask the fact that he was helpless against Eastern rivals closer to home. We've already seen how he lost Khaneti to Georgia. It was during his reign, too, that Trebizond's territory began seriously suffering from the Turcomans of Eastern Anatolia. We learn from the chronicler Michael Panaritos that the region of Khalivia was completely overtaken by them, who made that fertile land into pasture for their horses. Ioannis did try to counter this. He built a fort near Ineon and may have tried to lead the Trapezuntine army against the Turcomans when he died, since he fell far from the capital, in Limnia. a sort of fortified border province of the empire, which was the westernmost limit of Trebizond when Ioannis perished in 1297. The Turcomans penetrated so much into the empire that when his heir Alexios II ascended, the metropolitan Joseph Lazaropoulos remarked only major cities and some forts remained in imperial control in western Trebizond. Ioannis II's legacy was complicated. On the one hand, he sold Komnenian imperial dignity and kissed up to the Palaiologoi, as well as the Latins. But on the other hand, even if we know so little about the reign of his predecessor Georgios, it doesn't take a genius to know Trebizond was in a bad shape due to his anti-union schemes. Ioannis simply reversed everything Georgios did and left his son with a troubled, yet prosperous empire. Alexios II Megas Komnenos Palaiologos was one of, if not the best, emperors of Trebizond. Lazaropoulos, the future metropolitan of Trebizond born in his reign, was a prolific writer and had much to say about his beloved monarch. Even historians from Constantinople, like Georgios Pachimeris, had some praises for this ruler, which they discriminated as the Prince of the Laws. Why? Well, compare the Trapezuntine to his uncle, the contemporary emperor in Constantinople, Andronicos II Palaiologos, a weak, indecisive failure of a Vasileus, and you'll quickly learn to appreciate the former. Even Alexios was disgusted with Andronicos from a young age. He was sent by his father to be raised in Constantinople, but always had a mind of his own, refusing to be his uncle's pawn. He got this from his mother Evdokia, who, despite being Andronicos' sister, was a devoted empress to Trebizond, first and foremost. Remember back in my video on Andronicos, the Vasilevs had to save his ass from the Serbians by sacrificing a lady of his own family to marry Stefan Milutin. Well, his first choice was his widowed sister, Evdokia, who he called from Trebizond in 1298. Evdokia went all the way to say straight to her brother's face, no. Unfortunately, that meant Andronicos could only bend his 5-year-old daughter to his will as Milutin's child bride. Alexios wasn't going to end up like his poor cousin. Andronicos also planned to marry him to the house of one of his corrupt officials, Nikiforos Komnenos. But young Alexios married Georgian princess Gigek Kelly the moment he made it back to Trebizond, around 1300. Andronicos whined to ecclesiastical authorities, but even the church backed Alexios, as the teenage emperor of Trebizond made it legally impossible for them to annul their matrimony, since Gigek was already pregnant. Evdokia used trying to talk some sense into her son as a pretext to return to Trebizond in 1301, but she supported her boy all the way. She never returned to Constantinople, and she died in her beloved Trebizond the next year. Her second son, Michael, was still left there, and that was a loose end which will haunt Trebizond after Alexios' death. But we're ahead of ourselves. Let's discover the golden age of Trebizond under Alexios first. The Turcomans continued plaguing Trebizond. From Khalivia they now attacked the port of Kerasus, the second city of the Empire of Trebizond. In 1302, the young emperor decimated them, captured their ruler, Kustarga, and built a fort to further protect Kerasus. Then Alexios turned to the Genoese. The Latins finally showed their true colors and began imposing themselves over the locals, Romans and Georgians. Because the late Michael Palaiologos granted them trade monopoly, the Genoese thought it below them to even pay customs to local Black Sea sovereigns, and conflict built up slowly in Trebizond. In 1303, a fire broke in the city, possibly the first of a series of trade dispute violences in the capital. This continued for some years. In 1306, the Genoese threw a fit when some of their unrealistic demands were rejected by Alexios, and they threatened to leave Trebizond forever. Alexios didn't care. He could ask their Venetian rivals to take their place any time. So the arrogant Genoese tried to fly without even paying their duties. Alexios wasn't having that, and he set his Georgian mercenaries on them. Although the emperor's troops won the fight and burned their cargo, the Genoese committed arson on the armory of Trebizond. At last, the Genoese began to be humbled after this mutual devastation. Alexios allied with the Turcoman emir of Sinope to raid Genoese Crimean colonies from 1311 to 1314. So Genoa signed an official peace treaty in 1314. But after that, the Turcomans raided Trebizond instead, seizing a load of Trapezuntine tents in 1315, because the Roman night watchmen were careless. Also, particularly irritating Genoese individuals still annoyed Alexios, including a certain Megalolercari, who, after being slapped in the face during chess by one of the emperor's favorites, decided to commit atrocities in Trapezuntine coastal cities until Alexios gave up that favor to him. So, a second treaty with Genoa was ratified in 1316, in which Trebizond gave the Genoese traders immense privileges, like setting up their own fortified quarter in the capital. But they still weren't really satisfied, and to counter this, Alexios offered Venice the same privileges in 1319. Venice gratefully accepted. The Italians were now here to stay, and their presence cemented in the Pontic state. But neither Venice nor Genoa traded tax-free in Trebizond, unlike in Constantinople. Despite concessions, Alexios still came out on top of the Italian merchants, and he remained the master of his own economy. That was something his uncle Andronicus failed miserably at in Constantinople. Well, one of them anyway, because most of you remember Andronicus for his failures against the Turks, who were really becoming a headache for all Romans of Anatolia, in the west and the northeast. In the same year, Turkish pirates of Sinope again assaulted Trebizond and set fire to many beautiful parts of the city. This Beylik of Sinope became a top-tier naval power under Gazi Çelebi, the grandson of Sinope's conqueror, who partnered with Alexios against the Genoese. He preyed on Genoese and Romans ruthlessly. Luckily, Alexios didn't have to worry about Gazi Çelebi anymore, who died in 1322 with no sons. So, Sinope passed to the Chandarid dynasty. The Chandarids were a small Turkic beylik in Kastamonu, ironically, which was also the dynastic cradle of the Komneni. Even more ironic was the fact that they'd actually physically joined houses with the Komneni, as one of Alexios' daughters would marry a Chandarid bey of Sinope in the future, constituting, perhaps, the first case of a Megali Komneni princess marrying neighboring Turkic rulers, a diplomatic strategy Trebizond would be famous for. Going onwards, it will be impossible to study Trebizond without studying the Turcoman environs they found themselves surrounded by, so do bear with me. As of now, Alexios could only anticipate future naval raids by building a new wall in the west of his capital in 1324, after the new masters of Sinope traumatized the Genoese with a particularly heinous act of piracy. But Genoese traders were undeterred by the dangers of the Black Sea and frequented Trebizond only more and more going forward. Trebizond's renown grew in Italy, and in 1329, the Pope was trying really hard to convert the magnificent emperor with such a valuable realm to Catholicism. Alexios didn't, and in 1330, he died of bubonic plague. His death was mourned by all Trapezuntines. The 14th century was difficult for all Romans. Both Constantinople and Trebizond suffered from Turkic invasion and Italian aggression. But in Constantinople, Andronicus II was overwhelmed by them, while in Trebizond, Alexios II held them at bay. The Emperor of Trebizond vigorously defended his empire, and in spite of every challenge, Trebizond was prospering like never before. So no wonder his subjects loved him, and eulogies were written by both Lazaropoulos and his protonotarius Konstantinos Loukidis, who described Alexios as brave as Samson, beautiful as Joseph, mild as David, wise as Solomon, hospitable as Abraham. Alright, so what was this golden age of Trebizond like? Now at the end of the video, let's finally take a look. The wealth of Trebizond we have already described enough. The Trapezuntines were swimming in silver, now being a major city of trade and earning from customs. Alexios II's silver aspers were also modified, with elaborations in design. You can now see plants on them, and Saint Ioannis of Trebizond, who was always depicted standing in coins of his predecessors, was now shown on horseback. Why Alexios made this change is unclear. It's either a regional fashion or related to a popular Trapezuntine legend of him slaying a dragon. Yep, Alexios II was a dragon slayer, and Lazaropoulos covered this tale in length. If you're interested in how Alexios saved Trebizond from a nasty dragon, then check out my video on Byzantine dragon slayer stories. Lazaropoulos reports that the dragon's skull was kept in the palace of Trebizond, where the Megali Komneni held grand festivals and ceremonies daily. Being Komneni, their imperial rituals were more antiquated than those of the Palaiologoi in Constantinople, reminding the populace of the good old days. But this traditionalism did not hinder the Trapezuntines from being open to influences from all nations, like Romans of antiquity. Trebizond became more cosmopolitan by the day. It was home to Romans, Laz, Georgians, Armenians, Italians, Turks, Arabs, Mongols, and more. What Lazaropoulos also tells us is that Alexios, himself quite educated, was a great patron of philosophy and science. Trebizond wasn't known for intellectual achievements in the 13th century, but now it changed. The most famous example was, of course, how Alexios helped the Constantinopolitan scholar Grigorios Chioniadis reach the Ilkhanate to study Persian astronomy. And Chioniadis made astronomy the hottest science among the biggest brains of Constantinople, from Medohitis to Grigoras, before returning to teach in Trebizond. He influenced many in Trebizond too. His friend Loukidis took on an interest in astrology and commissioned a horoscope. Perhaps the only example of a Byzantine horoscope we have surviving today. Chioniadis and many professors gave lectures in the capital. We speculate that there may have been an Academy of Trebizond, like the Uni of Constantinople. His legacy was carried out by a local monk, Manuel, who inherited his knowledge and also learned Persian. Manuel then taught astronomy to the physician, Georgios Chrysokokis, who published the work Persian Compendium in Constantinople and was much appreciated not only by contemporary Romans, but also later Ottomans and Renaissance Europeans. So that's the tip of the iceberg on Trapezuntine intellectual culture, and we've only lightly touched on their astronomical tradition. Point is, Trebizond was not behind Constantinople and even influenced it greatly. Finally, back to the point I made at the beginning about Trebizond looking east. I hope you see by now how, after Trebizond dropped its claims to the throne of Constantinople, the Megali Komneni began to truly work around their new realities. They weren't just another Constantinopolitan elite in exile, but they became a local Pontic Roman imperial dynasty. They knew they were here to stay for good, so they further adorned the Trapezuntine Empire with building projects, and we'll see in future episodes important monastic foundations too. They assimilated, adopted native ideologies, like the proud separatism of the old laws and Greek lords of Pontus, such as the Gavradis, who used to cause so many head sores of the original Komnenian dynasty. These old Pontian lords were acritic nobles of the earlier Eastern Roman Empire. They have long since learned to survive and flourish on the harsh frontiers with the Muslim world without relying on Constantinople. This separatism wasn't only aimed at the Queen of Cities, but also Turcoman and Turkish neighbors. There's a reason why Pontus resisted Turkification for much longer than the rest of Anatolia. And the emperors encouraged them to defend themselves against invaders, which made up for the weaker military of Trebizond. They forged many dynastic alliances with local Trapezuntine and Georgian nobility. But Trapezuntine separatism wasn't isolationism or chauvinism. They were incredibly open and welcoming to the world. They just didn't let anyone else mess with them. The Italians traded affluently along their territory given that they respected the empire's commercial law. Constantinopolitans exchanged scholarly achievements voluminously with them, given that they stopped interfering in Trapezuntine affairs. And Turcomans cohabited peacefully, sometimes even allied, with the Romans, given that they didn't raid Trebizond. I've done a lot of comparisons of the Megali Komneni with the Palaiologoi already, but just stick with me for a final one, I promise. In contrast with Trebizond embracing their situation, the Palaiologoi kept pretending to be ruling over a universal empire without having the means to maintain and defend the meager territory they had left. The elite in Constantinople fought futilely over their court status and ever-diminishing appanages, instead of catering to the needs of Roman provincials. They did not adjust well to the fickle late medieval world, and coped with their losses by obsessing even more over the glory days of their classical Greek past, unlike Trapezuntines who created a new golden age for themselves. This was the peak of Trapezuntine imperial performance, an achievement of Alexios II Megas Komnenos after some trying times under his father Ioannis II. Going forward, it would be challenging to keep this up, but the future emperors kept the spirit to heart and still did their best. But sadly, they were soon to catch the Palaiologan plague of civil wars which would trouble Trebizond for 2 decades after Alexios passed away. So, I hope you will be excited to learn about that. And no, I will not apologize for slandering the Palaiologoi so much today. I did grow attached to them, but they deserve it. Especially Andronicus II, who really should have learned a bit from his more successful Trapezuntine nephew. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons: Dragon Lord, Morbea Game Projects, Cody Dan Roth, Tiropita Productions, Francis Morin, Archduke Romali Niels Lanz, Patrick Apple, and Kia Sick. Thanks everyone. Ay,